So the fourth section of my interview with the CCMA's Commissioner Pheko Molefe continues our discussion on the employees' ability to participate in public participation sessions facilitated by the government around the promulgation, in this case, of labor laws, right? And essentially what I was saying, well, I don't want to repeat too much what I was saying because I said it in my commentary on the third section of the interview. But one thing that Mr. Pheko Molefe says is that the restrictions or the degree to which an employee is restricted to participate really depends on the way he says it is, the employee's sophistication, right? Which actually, my understanding of what he means there, he means by the level of ignorance that the employee has, right? So the less ignorant an employee is, the more they're aware of their rights, the more they're aware that these participation sessions are even being held, right? And therefore they can take actions and assess their options by way of participating. All right. So so it's not just the ignorance level. Actually, it's also, he mentions their access to resources, which, I mean, they go hand in hand, right? I mean, the more resources you have access to develop yourself, the less ignorant you become. Therefore, the more active you become as a citizen. All right. At least that's how I see it. I understand what he's trying to say. He goes on to say, you don't necessarily have to and this goes again, it counts towards ignorance. You don't necessarily have to participate in person. You don't necessarily have to attend these sessions in person. You can send in a letter, write an email, and basically use other forms of mediums, communication mediums, to have your voice heard. All right. Now, the reason I'm raising this is because, look, your sophistication as a citizen, as an employee, is your responsibility. You have to make sure that you're aware of what's happening around you. That should not be something you're force-fed. All right, and I totally agree with that. And therefore, that does not actually speak to the inequality between the employee and the employer. If an employee is ignorant because they don't use the resources they have access to decrease their level of ignorance, then you can't blame the employer for that. This is also something that I touched upon, and I guess I will touch upon it again in this case. The degree of sophistication of the employee does not. I feel like it does address, to a certain extent, the employee's ability to better represent themselves in the employment relationship. But there are certain systemic or systematic, I know there's a difference between the two of those, I just don't remember the difference. But, there's a system-wide mechanism that is imposing restrictions on employees, which is a mechanism that is beyond the control of the employee, right? A legislative mechanism, right? When I was asking this question to Mr. Pheko Molefe, I spoke about the fact that, and we do actually discuss this, going forward in this section of the interview. The employee doesn't have much of a say when it comes to the drafting of the employment contract, for example, right? They have a say in how marketable they are, right? They have a say in how sophisticated they are. They have a say they have a control over these things. But they should have an input on drafting the employment contract, and they don't. And that's a systemic issue. I mean, you will see, I think you would have seen throughout this section, this fourth section, that the domain of the employment relationship is considered, even by the CCMA, as shown by Mr. Pheko's stance on that. It's considered the domain of the employer, not the domain of both. The relationship is between the both of them, but it's considered the domain of the employer. right? And I'll get into this when we get to employment engagement. But I agree that employees, citizens, are responsible for their own personal, individual development, right? Both in terms of their acquiring skills, but also in acquiring awareness about the environment, about the laws, about what's happening in the markets and so on. But that does not fully address the fact that there are certain systemic pressures upon them that inhibit, to a great extent, their ability to fully utilize their power to do that. You understand? So, for example, I touched upon the employment contract, and on top of that, socially set expectations on what else an employee is supposed to do over and above their responsibilities as stated in the employment contract. This is also written in my article. So you find in many cases employees are ignorant, not necessarily because they want to be ignorant, but because they work from 8 to 4 or from 9 to 5 or from 8 to 5, however long, but basically the whole day. They spend more time at work than at home, as Mr. Pecco acknowledges. And therefore, when they get home, they've got their homely duties to their families. They've got responsibilities. This is now after hours now. So when is an average employee going to find the time to now start reading and researching on A, B, C, D, and E outside of their work hours so that they can clue themselves up on what's happening in the environment? Right? This is a reality for a lot of workers, for a lot of employees. People are not ignorant by choice most of the time. They do want to be able to make their own decisions and not just have their opinions influenced by mass media that continually bombards them as they go about their lives, right? But in most cases, the mass media is the only source of information because people don't have the time to research. People don't have the time. They're busy trying to survive. He goes on to mention, in addressing this, he goes on to mention that, look, the CCMA has got certain discretionary functions, which includes basically uplifting society in various ways that are relevant to their function in the markets. Awareness campaigns about employee rights and equity issues and so on and so forth. That's all good and well. But considering that the CCMA, I would expect that they're one of the social partners of the state in their involvement and participation in labor legislation promulgation debates, right? Like at NADLEC, for example, right? They are a social partner that is influencing citizens who should be a social partner in how to now perceive these legislations and how to perceive their own rights. And that's essentially where I'm coming from. Employees need to be able to have a voice in representing their own value, their own rights, their own perspective on this whole market mechanism, or on this whole market. Right? And that is what is missing. We then moved on to discuss whether or not the CCMA belongs or should be in the job interview. Not to be too hard on myself, but considering the way our conversation has gone and what we've discussed up to this point, I feel like the question was a little bit unnecessary. But because we did already, he did already stipulate that the CCMA belongs way after, comes way after the internal process has failed. CCMA does not necessarily get involved in internal matters unless invited by the employer, as in the case of a hearing, as I mentioned earlier on. But basically my point here was, in what ways, for example, could the CCMA assist the employee in better representing him or herself in the job interview, meaning in the establishment of the employment relationship, right? So look, yeah, he did again reiterate what he said in the previous sections, that no, it is an internal matter. By internal matter, basically he means it is the employer's matter, meaning I don't want to step on the employer's toes. Right? Do you see what I'm getting at? So what is the employee in all of this? But a pawn. Mr. Peku then goes on to mention, there are market forces. And, I don't know why every time I hear the word market forces, I feel like the employee, everything that is wrong, that goes wrong, or that restricts the employee, or that is disadvantageous for the employee, is put on the employee's shoulders. Like, no, the reason why you are not representing yourself is because you're not sophisticated enough. You're not educated enough. You're not skilled enough. These are your problems. Go sort yourself out. The system is fine. The market is fine. The legislation is fine. The fact that you're not participating in the labor market or the market in general to your fullest potential is not the problem. You need to, and for you, in fact, for you to participate to your full potential in the market is for you to become a more compliant but more skilled slave or employee. Whereas from the way I see it, the full potential of an employee is realized when that employee can speak to an employer on equal terms when they're starting to establish the employment relationship. Speak on equal terms, right? Because there's no one, it's an internal matter. It's an internal matter, but we're both equal. Now, one thing you should understand, I'm not blaming the employer for this inequality. I am partially blaming the state, and I am blaming the employer together with the state and the other social partners. Yes, because they're in collusion to facilitate a market such as this. But at the end of the day, it's their fault, but it's not their responsibility. The responsibility, and that's why I said I agree with this, is on the employee, but not necessarily on the employee as an individual, more like on the employee as a class, right? And that goes into, the actual solution, which, as I said, I won't say here. You guys have to read my article. Now, like I said before, we're gonna get to the issue of employment engagement. I do ask him more generally, which was not a very well formulated question, on what employment engagement is. But yeah, I explained to him, as I've written in my article, my perspective on employment engagement, and therefore my criticism, towards it. So he then responded by saying, look, employees spend more time at work than at home. And then he goes on to do what I said earlier on, which is to give the responsibility of creating a harmonious work environment to the employer. So essentially, if you look at it, the employer is in charge of the employment relationship. And that is my fundamental problem. Why? Well, I do know why, but, I have an opinion as to why, which is why I have a solution that I present in my article. But yeah, that is the problem. And he's saying some employers are doing their best. I figure that he's speaking to transformation and progressiveness, which I actually discussed in my commentary of the previous section, to say that progressiveness and transformation do not deal with the fundamental inequalities. They don't. They're like employee engagement. Employee engagement doesn't deal with the needs of the employee. Not really. They deal with controlling access to resources needed by the employee, so that you control the employee and the employee's performance thereof. So it's really not a service to employees at all. Employee engagement is not a service to employees. It's an exploitation of employees by leveraging their need for resources and not giving them those resources, but rather tying those resources to the employment relationship. You are not allowing the employee to be a separate entity, of which an employee is separate from the employer. So the employer seeks to bind the employee to him or herself or itself as a corporation or so on, by leveraging these needs. If you work for me, we have daycare at our offices. We have doctors at our offices. The job provides you with insurance. So they don't give you enough to pay for your own insurance. Okay? They don't give you enough. They pay, what they do is they say, no, you work for us, part of the package, cost to company, right, is that we'll pay a portion of your insurance, and we'll pay a portion of your sorry, there's a bit of noise, but a portion of your petrol, a portion of your car service, and so on and so forth. They're doing these things to increase the employee's dependence on the employment relationship, not to benefit the employee.
Lucas.